Alrighty. Hello, welcome everyone. I know we have a few people still joining in, but in the interest of time, I will just kick off the intro and have BC and Frank begin. We will have this fully recorded and sent to all the registrants, so no worries if you miss part of it. This will be sent out via email afterwards. So. Hi, everyone. I am Amy from Centime, and I will be our moderator today. We have got a 30-minute candid conversation debate with our panelists, BC and Frank here. And it's the first part in a multi-part webinar series that we're calling Virtual Cards Redefined. Um, Quick housekeeping, we're recording this. As I mentioned, we'll send it out afterwards. Feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A anytime. And again, not trying to add any fluff. So without further ado, BC will hand it over to you.
Well, thank you, Amy. I have like a 200 slide presentation, so I need all the time I can get. But seriously, the goal is for us to really begin a more introspective conversation on this topic of card payments in B2B. And in particular, what we wanted to do is to kind of really take a more balanced approach, to the opportunity for card payments. Um, very briefly, my name is BC Krishna. I'm the founder and CEO of Centime. Frank, do you take a second and then we'll dive right in?
Thanks, BC. Pleasure to join this discussion. Frank Martien. I am a strategy consultant focused on B2B payments and have been working in consulting since 1996.
And I would think of Frank as the sort of, preeminent authority on this topic. He's been following it very, very closely for years and years and years across many different issuers, across many different trends, secular or not. And so our format today is really more of, and I've known Frank for how long, 10 years or something. And our format today is just really banter, and just talk about this. And to be clear, I think that, I wouldn't say that I'm sour on the topic. I'm certainly not. I believe very strongly in cards as a form of payments in B2B. But I'm also somewhat of a realist when it comes to trying to separate the promise versus the reality. For years and years and years, we've been talking about how cars are great and virtual cars are amazing and fantastic. But the reality is, I think, a little different. And so I think that I want to sort of have this discussion, this debate with Frank. We'll share a few data points. And, our intention is to really spend over the course of 4 sessions, really dig into this topic from a number of different angles. Today, the whole goal is to set the stage for, where we are, right? Take an introspective look at the data, banter back and forth on what we believe to be the challenges are, not get sucked into thinking that, oh, it's all great. Let's just sort of keep doing more of it because the data suggests that it's not. And then what we want to then do in subsequent sessions is to have more in-depth discussions. We're setting up a little bit of a food fight between buyers and suppliers, to get their perspectives on this topic and so on and so forth. And eventually, what we wanted to do is to share a more concrete view into how some of these solutions can be addressed at scale. That's the objective. I'm going to start by turning changing you want to just say anything, Frank? Because I want to sort of share a few data points before we dive in.
Sure. I think, BC, we've had a great series of debates over the years regarding the role of virtual cards. I have tended to be more, at sometimes more optimistic regarding the opportunity for particularly virtual cards within invoice-based payments for a variety of reasons. But I certainly respect that we sometimes have opposing views on that, and I think that'll be part of the fun of today's discussion is really to bounce those ideas back and forth and see where we may have common ground as well.
There's nothing like looking at data, and I think that, as the saying goes, two people can be blindfolded, touch the animal, different parts of the animal and come away feeling like, these are different animals. I don't think we're that far off, but I have some data to share. Frank has some data to share. I think what we wanted to do is to start there, and then begin the conversation. So I'm going to share my slides, and then share my perspective. And Frank, please challenge me, right? I mean, I'm more than anybody that I'm pretty opinionated, but please challenge me and make sure that we don't get off on some kind of preordained path, whether it happens to be pro or anti. So we'll start by sharing my screen. Please may bear with me. Take a second. All right, so here we go. So, of course, this is the topic. What I wanted to do is to say that, from my standpoint, now Frank, of course, has a slightly different perspective, but from my standpoint, I'm going to take a somewhat sour look, at the volumes and trends. And the data it's interesting, right? As I kind of dug into the data, there's just a lot of data on this, but none of it is exactly how you want it. But trying to piece together some of these trends is a little challenging, but I think you can kind of get there by taking all of these different elements. So what I'm about to share with you is a little bit qualitative, a little bit quantitative, but I want to start with the quantitative stuff. Let me just sort of step back and say, like, okay, we're all human beings, right? And over the course of, we're probably all grown-ups as well. I don't think there's any kind of, two young people in the audience here today. But as grown-ups, we buy things and we make payments. We never think about anything other than a card to make a payment, right? I mean, this just sort of becomes so ingrained into what we do that it's completely natural that as a human being, going to a grocery store or buying something online, I don't even think about it. I don't say, like, do I pay by card? Do I do ACH? Do I do this? No, I just pay, and card is like what I do. But the same human being sitting in the context of an invoice to pay process doesn't have the same, you know, whether you call it luxury or mental approach, to making those payments. I think this is kind of a very interesting shift, right? The same human being thinks about these two different processes, whether it's a consumer payment or a B2B invoice to pay type of situation, very differently. And so the data suggests that that's true, right? I mean, here's a kind of an analysis of this data and just comparing consumer versus B2B in the next two slides. First and foremost, I think that everybody knows this. Consumer payments tend to be the average consumer payment is much smaller than the average B2B payments by one order or two orders of magnitude. Pretty significant, right? $50 to $70 versus $2,300. And again, these are broad sort of averages, and averages can lie, but I think that it gives you a sense for the difference, in and to some extent, like why we are where we are. The second point is that, something like 65% of uh, payments in the consumer space are credit cards, whereas, in B2B, it's just a paltry 2%. Again, like, dramatic, right? Not only in terms of, like, the difference between the two, but how important cards are for consumer payments. 65%. There's nothing that comes even close, to any other form of payment. No question, right? But when it comes to B2B, you see, like, this is nothing, cards don't even come close, to anything that, can become a real sort of, opportunity to displace what's happening with the kind of down sort of, word trending checks. So this is just the reality of where we are now. You can say it's 2%, you can say it's 5%, but that's kind of where we are. This particular analysis actually lumps, some of the P card payments, into other. If you take those two together, it sort of tends to be about 5%. At this point, I just wanted to say that this might seem like I'm starting to become more and more bigoted away from cards. I'm not. I actually am a huge believer in cards. And I think that there's tremendous opportunity for us as an industry and for the issuing partners that we work with to actually drive more payments onto cards. But something has to change. it can't be the same thing over and over and over again, beating our heads against the wall, saying like all we have to do is to like shout louder. And so that trend is also what you see here, right? This is again slightly different data, but still indicative of the problem. This is kind of data from the AFP, which does triennial analyses every 3 years or so. They kind of ask their audience, which tends to be slightly more on the corporate side as opposed to even mid-market. But it's evident that the trends are towards ACH and away from checks, and cards not really doing much.
Yeah, BC,
So
I wanted to chime in on this slide. Of course, this would be the percent of transactions.
that's correct.
And so why would the commercial card market, virtual card market be growing, 10, 15, 20% over this period? Two things. One is obviously overall B2B spending has been growing. And then secondly, we've definitely seen an increase in transaction sizes, particularly with virtual card capabilities, where companies are more comfortable putting invoice-based payments on card.
So Frank, just to make sure that I understand your perspective on this, your data suggests that the trends are a little different than what I'm presenting here. Is that an accurate statement?
Well, I think the two could potentially be consistent. It's just that even with a mid-single digit type percentage, which I think most people in the market would agree with on invoice-based payments, you can still drive dollar growth, and the card industry arguably is more focused on the spend levels versus the number of transactions, just based on how the economics work for cards.
Of course, yeah, because it's more of an ad valorem type of monetization, as opposed to check or ACH, which tends to be more volume of transaction based. A great point, right? And I think that's really comes down to it, which is that you might argue that the card industry doesn't really care about like capturing draw transaction percentages, but trying to drive towards more increasing the market share of higher and higher volume transactions. But is that trend playing out at scale?
Yeah, I would say those of us in the card industry certainly are focused on growing cards through much more sophisticated supplier enablement capabilities that we see in market, and we could share some data on that, as well as much more flexibility in pricing that has been offered by the networks and some of the fintechs to provide opportunities for suppliers to reconsider taking cards. The other one other caveat about this data is if a supplier receives an ACH payment, there could be some transactions that began as a card payment. Um, and this is what's called buyer funded cards, and offered again by several of the fintechs. So from the buyer's perspective, it is a card payment, and there is network economics associated with those. But from the supplier's perspective, they just see the ACH, so they might report that as an ACH.
And
We've
that's
even we've even seen instances of 16-digit card numbers being sent to suppliers via an enhanced ACH information file. So sort of almost like a pre-note ACH with the card instructions inside. So all sorts of um, interwoven payments. Even a buyer-initiated payment, that is card-based BC, some merchants may still think of that as ACH as being deposited in the merchant account, but since they don't have to fiddle around with the card numbers themselves, they may think of that as ACH.
so let me ask the hard question, right? I think in that situation, so one thing, let's just sort of, dig into that a little bit more, Frank. The general expectation is that the supplier pays the discount, right? The merchant interchange. I mean, that's just generally always the case, right? I mean, I don't know of too many situations where at scale you make a card payment and are willing to accept, the fees for it. Is that an accurate statement?
I think historically it has been, but we've seen a lot of activity with buyer funded cards that switch that model to the buyer side. And you might say, well, why would the buyer ever want to pay a transaction fee? Sometimes the buyer's paying a transaction fee because those transaction fees will be less than the incremental rebate they receive from achieving a higher um, fill a tier level on the rebate schedule. And or sometimes they may be looking for a buyer funded card and pay the transaction fee just for consistency. If they can do uh, obviously, this would be a unique buyer, but if a buyer can pay most of its payments by card and only has a few stragglers, so to speak, on the supplier side, they may just decide put everything on card. Then we have the exact same payment modality on our side, and we'll pay a little bit in fees, for the price of that consistency and operational excellence that we have on the buy side.
And how much of that, Frank, is it more, anecdotal, episodic? Are you seeing what's happening in the industry with buyer funded card payments, buyer initiated card payments as more of a secular trend?
Yeah, I mean, Comdata's offered it for years, now called Corpay, of course.
Yep.
So this is a product. They have priority bought plastic, and
Yep.
plastic previously, I think, had plans to go public, and so there were some public numbers out there on the size of that program. Uh, and it is we're also seeing some private network activity from some of the banks that where if a certain bank banks the buyer and the seller at the same time, there's an alternative set of rails. It still may use the network rails for authorization and so forth, but can also have an entirely different set of economics. So
Right,
the
because
general point.
almost like a closed loop system, sort of a virtual closed loop kind of thing where you see both sides of the transaction. But go ahead, please. Yeah.
Yeah, and we have a quarterly B2B KPIs publication that's available on my LinkedIn site, as well as Windward Strategies. And people could take a look at that because from time to time, we will do some analysis to opine on what percent of some of these fintechs uh, volume is actually card network rail settled, versus other. And again, some of that card network rail settled activity, may include traditional purchasing cards, traditional virtual cards, supplier initiated payments, for instance, as well as some of these newer product variants that we've been discussing.
So what? So I would suggest to you that there's all this like amazing, wonderful, creative approaches that the industry is taking to try to drive more payments on cards. In some cases, it's about cost. In some cases, about making sure that the economics are equitably distributed between buyer and supplier. In some cases, it's about process. And by the way, I'm a huge believer, as you are, in the benefits to the supplier of moving to buyer initiated payments, because obviously there are two things that happen, right? Tell me if you disagree. One is that you don't have to worry about like, oh my God, I got to fish this card out of, virtual card out of some portal or email, and I got to sit down and process it and so on and so forth. It gets, hey, posted to my, my bank account, and I don't have to worry about it, number one. But number two, more importantly, I think the opportunity base is suddenly dramatically bigger, right? Now you don't have to be a card accepting merchant to receive a payment.
Oh, that's right. That's right. And I think, BC, you've spoken for years about the need to improve the supplier experience. And I think it's fair to say you had mentioned buyer initiated payments, also buyer funded cards. The
Yep.
fact those will settle as an ACH with the supplier. It's sort of a variant on the concept of buyer initiated payments, but it needs the supplier's bank account instructions instead of their mid. So that's a
Yep.
little bit of a nuance. But anyways, all of these are towards making life easier, on the supplier side, because I think people recognize, for supplier, and there are even fintechs out there, we know who they are, who will ingest inbound emailed supplier initiated cards and then convert those over to buyer initiated payments.
Yeah.
So all
All
in the
kinds of
spirit,
crazy hacks, I got to tell you. Like,
yeah, all
people
in the
will do
spirit of
anything.
making life easier. Of course, for the supplier, which has long been your thesis, and we agree on that. There's no debate.
I want to get to that in a second because I want to lay bare the idea that, when it comes to suppliers, and how we can drive more payments, all of this leads in the same general direction, right? And before I go there, I'll just say, like, the buyer initiated payments versus buyer funded cards, right? So just to set the stage, buyer initiated payments are pushing card payments directly to the supplier account, right? Supplier bank account. Supplier might or might not have a merchant account, which is fine. But the benefit is that it gets posted directly to their account. They don't have to, like, process the transaction manually. I think that that's one point. The second point I want to come back to is this buyer funded, and then the plastic model, so to speak, right, was that, hey, I'm going to basically turn all of the interchange and merchant discount over to the buyer rather than the supplier. So if I'm making $100 payment, the supplier receives $100 in full, whereas the 2.5, 3%, is charged to the buyer. And the premise is, as you've said, that the 3% um, has benefit, right, to the buyer. They get float, they get rebates. And by the way, if you look at the net cost, not the gross, and you sort of, compare how much you're paying versus how much, perhaps rebates you're getting, it turns out not to be as bad as it seems. But
Yeah, and
if
the you'll really enjoy this, BC. So in the buyer funded model, there will be scenarios where the supplier receives a paper check.
Oh my God.
And and that actually can maximize the float benefit for the fintech.
That is just such a horrible hack, I got to tell you, right?
Now,
It's so
now one thing though, long live the check, right? So one of the well-known check vendors in a long time, check vendors in the industry, obviously has sought to keep up with automation trends. And so there's this concept of a electronic lockbox where if if for instance a fintech was going to send a paper check to a supplier, potentially no check is written necessarily, so that check is electronically transmitted to the supplier's bank, and therefore, and even with Check 21 years ago, there have been all sorts of initiatives to keep checks alive. So certainly there's been a significant reduction in checks, particularly post pandemic BC, but we still anticipate that companies are going to want to keep checks around.
Yeah, I mean, this sort of what you're mentioning is this concept of an e-check, right? Where, I receive a quote unquote check, but I post a check 21 format, file directly to my bank account. There's a long story as a sidebar. I dug into that and went down that rabbit hole for a very long time, Frank, and I discovered that there's a UCC kind of guidelines from many years ago that suggest that a check is not a check until it's actually printed. And so
Uh,
you can't technically take the check or a check instrument all the way from issuer to recipient, from buyer to supplier, without first having a printed component to it. Because if you didn't, then technically, of course, nobody cares about it, but technically it doesn't, conform to all the various regs that the Federal Reserve Bank requires of you. So anyway, as I said, it's a rabbit hole and it's a discussion for another time. But back to this sort of notion of buyer funded card payments and the concept that buyers will and can take the entire sort of, interchange. The reality is that it's not a zero-sum game. It's not necessarily the case that all fees have to be paid by the supplier and all fees have to be paid by buyer. The reality is that both parties are getting a benefit. Why not, actually set this up? And I'm talking about not episodic here and there types of things, but how do we get from 5% to 25% to 20 or 30%, right? And if you're going to do that, you really have to, like, figure out how to equitably and easily distribute that 2.5, 3% cost, between buyer and supplier. You don't have to have the buyer take all of the fees. You don't have to have the supplier take all of the fees. Maybe the answer is like, hey, it depends upon how much is being paid, when it's being paid, right? And what the
Yeah,
circumstances are. And I think
yeah, and
that's
I
really,
think I think the card industry is going to school on ACH Plus because, with ACH Plus, you as a provider, as a fintech or a bank, you have to construct each aspect of the product uh, on a um, on a standalone basis. What will be the settlement terms? Are we offering working capital to the buyer? Are we offering working capital to the supplier? Benefit through faster payments, or even the bank sitting between that transaction for a period of time on a funding basis. What information, what data is transmitted, transaction fees, if any. Usually those are on the supplier side for ACH Plus, but I haven't heard about buyer funded ACH Plus, so to speak, but I'm sure it's something that could be done. But at any rate, credit cards traditionally were a prepackaged, sort of pre-shrunk, shrink wrap prepackaged product that had all of that predefined, but also without as much flexibility as what I'm describing. And, we are entering an age with embedded finance and so forth that it has become a lot less costly to be able to reconfigure, a card product and run payments on card rails that much more closely match what a supplier and a buyer's objectives would be, and really just maximizing, to the extent that cards can, to your point, become 20% or whatever, that would be sort of based on economically rational, buyer seller maximizing behavior, as facilitated by all the networks, the providers, the banks, and so forth. So far from being we think that would be a marvelous thing, and hopefully at the expense of checks, which everyone, even notwithstanding the efficiencies, most people think of checks as less efficient. And we had the question about what's the cost of processing a check. It's, my God, you could go through all sorts of caveats and say, well, what kind of check? E-check,
yeah.
e-lockbox, and the like.
Yeah, and again, there's probably a whole separate sort of sidebar webinar on the whole concept of what people are calling ACH plus, which at some level is such a hack as well, right? I mean, there is no such thing as ACH. It just turns out to be like, something that people say, I'm just going to charge you for ACH, and somehow try to, browbeat you into acceptance because guess what? I have leverage. But that's another topic for another time. But I do want to spend in the last few minutes that we have left to kind of, set the stage for maybe the continuing conversation here. We may run over a little bit, and that's okay. Is that we've talked a lot about like the different ways in which the industry and the community are trying to like solve this problem of trying to do more volume, whether it's buyer initiated payments or buyer funded payments or whatever. There's a bunch of different things, but the kind of big elephant in the room, of course, is cost. And the question really is, um, you know, um, the when you talk about an average transaction being, let's say, $2,000, right? I mean, paying $60 for a card payment is pretty high, all things considered. And maybe I am of the opinion that actually cost is not that big of an issue, especially because the industry, the networks in particular, have done a pretty good job of establishing between level three and large ticket, that really allows us, people like us, to actually sort of, shine a light on the fact that it's not 3%, it's actually 1.9%. But we have to like really make sure that sort of we take advantage of the fact that this data is available and to implement the processes that can support the use of large ticket. Your thoughts?
Yeah, that's right. And the merchant acquiring community historically has been lagging, so obviously the networks and the issuers can do everything. They could run a transaction at 10 basis points interchange theoretically, and yet if that supplier is signed up for bundled pricing with the acquirer, they're not seeing the benefit. And obviously you mentioned the level three interchange piece as well. So So there certainly are some fintechs and certain acquirers that we've seen them at CPI conferences and so forth. So we know who these people are, who are really working to promote cards, in the market. And yeah, and it'll just be it's an amazing time, of transition that we're seeing, and now there's all sorts of talk in Europe about growth in card-based payments on the B2B side. And that's really, as we understand it, there had been concerns about using lower proprietary interchange rates in Europe and maybe resulting in centrally billed commercial cards falling into the regulated interchange rates, and that concern has abated. Once again, to the extent the industry, I'll say the word self-regulating itself and providing a dynamic market for buyers and suppliers to much more actively work through pricing, and certainly buyers to spend less time thinking about rebates, which we often think is the least of the benefits of cards. These are all emblematic, we think, of a vigorous competitive market, even on the card side.
And that's really the main point, right? Which is it is a very, I mean, you don't hear a lot about how amazingly, processing of ACH is like getting dramatic, right? It's not. I mean, it's like stable, it's wonderful, it's like nobody really cares, it just works, right? Same thing with checks, everyone knows how it works. But there is a significant amount of like, creativity, activity to help drive more payments on cards. And I think the discussion today, as you highlighted some, and I believe this, that there's just a lot of creative activity taking place on how do we drive more of these volumes? Because the reality is that there's opportunity, and there are many different options available for how to, basically, kind of connect the dots. And I think, today, I think you've highlighted some things, and I've tried to say, like, look, I think we can't just settle on saying that we just need to do more of the same and speak louder and louder to suppliers about like how, hey, the old virtual card thing is like wonderful. So we'll just maybe I want to, turn it over to you to some for some last words and then wrap up. Or did you go on mute? I think you went on mute.
Sorry, I really appreciate the discussion, BC, and the back and forth we always have, and looking forward to our next opportunity.
Thank you, Frank. And so I think I just want to wrap up by saying that, as I said at the top, the topic of how do we drive more virtual card payments is something that is going to continue to be debated. We think there's tremendous opportunities. Obviously, we're a software company that cares very deeply about this particular topic, and we have some ideas how to make this happen. We've kind of, hinted at what those ideas might be. And over the next 3 or 4 webinars, what we are going to do is to dig into this in some more detail so that we can lay bare what the sort of opportunities are and get into that some more. So stay tuned, same bad channel, same general format, about 30 minutes of pitched discussion. And look forward to spending more time with you guys.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye bye.